Hello and welcome to Read the Bull, the only podcast dedicated to finance and investing books. I'm your host, Stefan Prelog, and today we're live from the historic Troutbeck Inn, where I'm thrilled to be joined by Rob Copeland, author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Fund, Ray Dalio, Bridgewater Associates, and the Unraveling of a Wall Street Legend. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to read your bio because it's impressive, and we got to do that.
I love it.
Okay. So Rob's a banking and finance reporter for the New York Times, and he was previously a longtime hedge fund beat reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He's covered Silicon Valley and the hidden worlds of the wealthy and powerful. His front-page investigations into Bridgewater Associates won a New York Press Club award, and he was also awarded an honorable mention twice by the Society of American Business Writers, and was named a News Media Alliance Rising Star. I've heard you've appeared on ABC's Good Morning America, NPR, and other major networks. And The Fund is your first book.
It is, and I will say I never got the award from the Society of Business Journalists. I only got 2 honorable mentions.
Yeah, what's up?
Listen, we're going to get to the bottom of it today.
Yeah. All right, that's what this is all about. The Fund is a book about a major figure in finance, Ray Dalio. It's a bit of a biography, but it's really an examination and exploration of money and power and how it's harnessed and weaponized, but also a culture of management and investigation about one of the world's biggest hedge funds, Bridgewater Associates. So I was looking, reading it, it's a fascinating book. I was looking for analogs. And I told Rob, I didn't listen to any of other of his interviews. I like to come in fresh. So I don't know if anyone's brought this up, but there are a lot of analogs I was looking at in terms of books and films. So it's a little bit of an adult Lord of the Flies, maybe.
Sure.
1984.
For sure. Going Clear is a book about Scientology.
Okay.
There's something really interesting about this book, for me at least, which is that when I was writing it, when I was thinking about it, it is about Bridgewater, which is the world's biggest hedge fund. But there's very little in this book intentionally about what is a hedge fund. It's not, to me, a book about how you will get rich quick. So to me, it's much more of a thriller, much more of a nonfiction.
Yep. So
can't believe what you're reading.
Absolutely. So if you came in here looking for stock tips, I'm sorry.
That has actually happened once. I did get that question from someone. He said, "Are there any lessons from this book?" And I gave him many management lessons. And he said, "No, about how to become successful." And I was like, there are about 30 best-selling get-rich-quick books every week. So, yeah.
This is a little different. So okay. I think the other one I had was there was the book by Dave Eggers, The Circle.
The Circle. When I read The Circle, I actually my heart dropped a little bit because I thought it was about Bridgewater. It was that close.
Yeah.
The Circle is about a tech company, which has many similarities to Bridgewater.
Movie not as good, but yes.
The movie was. Can we curse at Troutbeck? Sure. The movie was dog shit. But the book, honestly, is there's a lot to be said for that book.
Yeah. Okay, good. As you said, it's one of the largest. I don't know if it is. It's currently managing still 130 billion. It's actually down a bit.
Much less, actually. It's actually under 90 billion.
Is it really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll talk about that and why. But let's start with Ray. So I understand he's a Wall Street titan. There are plenty of major figures in Wall Street that don't have books about them. Why is Ray different? Why is he a compelling figure worthy of a book?
So that's a fair question. And I think I can answer it by telling you a little bit about myself, besides that I never did win that award, which is that, I started as a business journalist at a trade publication. It's a hedge fund trade publication called Absolute Return. And so Bridgewater was the world's biggest hedge fund. So I knew what Bridgewater was. I knew who Ray Dalio was. And what happened was over time, over the 2010s, 2015, 2016, Ray started to get more and more famous. And it wasn't just because he ran this big hedge fund. He started talking about these things called principles. And he started sort of really ceasing entirely to have any interest in investing and just turning himself into a sort of self-help guru.
Yep.
So as he became more and more famous, this sort of picture that he painted of himself and that he became so truly world famous for was so different from the truth of what I knew from my reporting was happening inside the firm that I just felt like there could be, honestly, a whole book about that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's quite a book.
I actually wound up writing that book. Yeah.
There you go. Worked out. Yeah, so I want to start with a theme that you mentioned because we were talking a little bit before we came in here. There's a theme really in the book, theme of duality that's woven throughout the book. There seem to be two Bridgewaters, two Ray Dalios that you present to the reader. The outward one, molded by the press and PR in a usually successful hedge fund, led by, let's say, or appearing to be a benevolent leader, trying to make the world and workplace a better place. And there's the one that exists outside the spotlight, a firm that runs a rather simple hedge fund strategy led by a leader employing fear and intimidation to incentivize its employees. So you seem through your reporting and through this book, you're trying to break this facade almost and present the real Bridgewater and the real Ray. Was that the intention, or did it just kind of happen that way?
That was my intention for sure, but I would say that my number one priority was that Ray Dalio actually wrote a book about himself. It's called Principles, came out in, I believe, 2017. Yeah. And I was already thinking about writing a book about Bridgewater, and I honestly thought that when that book came out, it sort of took the wind out of my sails. I was like, well, someone's already written that book. How many books does the world need about Bridgewater? And that book was so misleading as to his nature, as to what was happening at Bridgewater. And what I really wanted to do was write the book just about how everyone else experienced the firm and this management culture. Because as he became more and more famous, it seemed like the only person that any of these hyper-famous journalists, Charlie Rose, Walter Isaacson, Gwyneth Paltrow, not a journalist, but hyper-famous, I think we can give her.
Yeah.
They were only talking to Ray. And I just thought, why don't we talk to literally everyone else? And that's really what I did.
Yeah. So how many people did you talk to? Do you have a running track? How many interviews did you do?
I do have a running track. It was definitely more than 200 interviews. Some people were interviewed more than once. Some were more helpful than others. Mm-hmm. But even more than that, I went back and I reconstructed the actual origin story of the character that is Ray Dalio. Yeah. And I did that by doing what I hope no one ever does. I read every article that he'd ever been quoted in from the mid-1970s. Wow. So even just doing that alone, and I'm a professional journalist and his unofficial biographer, I had never done that. And even if you just do that, you start to really unravel the facade.
Right. There are essentially two Ray Dalios, and you present one, and he's said it's not accurate.
I wouldn't expect him to say it were accurate.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I do want to go a little backwards and talk about Ray's response and Bridgewater's response. When did you first hear from Ray or Bridgewater, or there are many attorneys, about the book?
Sure. So, I have been talking on and off to Ray and Bridgewater for newspaper articles for close to a decade. Yeah. So they were familiar with the fact that I knew a lot about the firm that they preferred. People didn't know. And then in 2020, I, like the rest of us, was stuck at home, and I started to write a book proposal and eventually sold it to a publisher. And the first person I told that there would be a book, an unauthorized book about Ray Dalio, was Ray Dalio. Okay. I emailed him, and he responded in, I want to say, 30 minutes on a Sunday morning, and immediately began arguing with me about my intentions about a book that literally had not been written at that point. Mm-hmm. So they've known about it since mid 2020. They didn't stop complaining for years upon years upon years. Yeah. But at the end of the day, not to be like super jingoistic, the United States of America is a great place to be a journalist compared to any place else on earth. I don't care what your presidential politics are or anything. It's really amazing. It's very hard to stop a journalist from publishing a book. Yeah, thankfully that's true. So you were radically transparent with Ray from the beginning. I was radical for sure. But you mentioned, because Ray has this phrase, radical transparency. We'll get into that. Yeah. Over various times when Ray has said things about me that are untrue, and I'm not a character in this book. I don't want this to be a, David Goliath thing. I think there's a lot more interesting things that happened at Bridgewater than have to do with me. But I have noticed that if I use phrases from the Principles with Ray, it enrages him. It's like seeing his magic turned against him.
Huh.
I once sent him an email that after he said something that was not true, and I said, trust in truth, which is a principle.
Yeah.
And he had a very negative reaction to that one. So,
Okay. Well, yeah, we want to get into the principles and all that. So the seed of this book started with your reporting. So as you said, and that's where you and I got to know each other when you were at Absolute Return. You got to the Journal, and in 2014, and your beat was covering hedge funds. You were breaking news, reporting on performance, and you never, I would say, you never wilted. You covered people like Steve Cohen and SAC, Elliott Management, Pershing Square, Bill Ackman, all these big names. Your first article in Bridgewater seems to have been 2015. I'm just going to read the headline. Giant hedge fund Bridgewater flips view on China. No safe places to invest. Investment firm warns that recent stock gyrations will have broad negative repercussions. So that was the first article that you had written. What was the experience like with that article? What were your interactions with Ray like at that time?
that was hilarious. That was, first of all, when I wrote that article, that's an accurate headline. That is
Yeah.
that's a fair story.
Yeah.
It's a Wall Street Journal story. It's not one that I think that like we would all still be thinking about 9 years later. And it was based on the truth. I mean, it was based on a client note they had put out. It was my job as a beat reporter. Our readers pay us a lot of money to know what's secretly happening at hedge funds. And Ray lost his mind after about it, and called me and put out complaints saying I'd misrepresented him. And I said, how could I possibly have misrepresented you? I posted the entire note. I let the reader decide.
Right.
But what was sort of intoxicating about it was I've written a lot of pieces, and I continue to write pieces that, the subjects of them like them, the subjects don't like them. You sort of have to have like something wrong with your head where you just don't care a little bit. A lot of people, when they don't like what I write, they steam for a second and then they go on to their third Hamptons house. Like they're doing okay, everything's fine, or they go play with their kids or whatever. Ray could not. It was like he could not let it go.
Yeah.
And that has been an experience now going on 10 years.
So was that response typical throughout your interactions with him?
Oh yeah. I mean, he's so accustomed, and I should be fair to Ray, a lot of people who run successful investment firms are so accustomed to being the center of their own world.
Sure.
Not just at work, but with their spouses, with their kids, with their household staff. That I honestly think I was sort of interesting to him. Like I was like that like kid that like wouldn't take the no. I wasn't listening, but I really was listening. He just wasn't making any sense.
Okay. So you started to report on them, and then it was the article in 2016 that I would say really got his attention. And the headline was, "The world's largest hedge fund is building an algorithmic model from its employees' brains. Bridgewater wants day-to-day management, hiring, firing, decision-making to be guided by software that doles out instructions." How long did you work with Bridgewater on that article, and where did you start to learn that they were doing this, I guess? I know you can't reveal sources, but kind of what was the first tip, and how long did that article take to come out?
Well, this becomes a part of the book because there is a part of the book in which Ray sort of, like many charismatic leaders, becomes obsessed with living forever. And I didn't know that greater impetus at the time, but I knew that Bridgewater was trying to automate these decisions that you would think would have to be made by the manager or the CEO. And by the way, this is pre-AI.
Yeah.
I know this is only like less than a decade ago, but like this was weird stuff. And so they knew for months about the story. I had gone in, I had talked about it with Ray, actually. I had gone in for what was supposed to be a 1 hour interview that went on for, I think, 6 or 7 hours. I remember very distinctly his, to get through this book, Bridgewater has its own language. So they don't have chiefs of staff, they have what they call leveragers. And so Ray's leverager was sitting beside him the whole time. And she had told us it was her birthday in like the first hour. And just a very sweet thing. And we said, oh, happy birthday. 6 or 7 later, I was like, do you have birthday plans? So, her birthday was ruined by that article. If she's in this room right now, please stand up. I'll say I'm sorry.
So he had a really interesting response. And for the people that don't know, my job, my career is in public relations. I work with a firm that handles a lot of corporate financial services firms. So I remember, and one of my colleagues, Phil Murphy, here is in the room with me. We remember when Ray Dalio responded on LinkedIn to this article, but it wasn't for a few months later. But it was a really interesting response because we had never seen, and like you're saying, you'd never seen someone kind of react like this. They'd usually just, got on with their day, steamed for a little bit. He waited a few months, well, I guess a month later, I'm sorry, and posted a LinkedIn article called, the headline was, "The Fake and Distorted News Epidemic and Bridgewater's Recent Experience with the Wall Street Journal." So, and he goes on, I think it was like 3,000 words, right? This is 2017, and our president at the time had really given a model of how to deal with the press, and Ray was seemingly taking a page out of that, calling it fake news. But the fact that he posted this lengthy article on LinkedIn was really interesting. Tell us kind of what you thought when you saw that post, and kind of what were your interactions with him after that like?
Well, I've never been more certain that a story was correct. I'll tell you that much. What was interesting about that, and there were subsequent LinkedIns about it. One, he was very early and among business people, this is very different. He really was starting to attack me by name. It wasn't just me, my co-writer, Bradley, but then later a different co-writer, Rachel. He was really starting to make it personal, which is different. It was different. Usually they attack the organization. Two, you guys haven't known me for so long, but do I strike you as someone who would enter into an agreement to reset the relationship with a billionaire that I was covering for my job as a journalist? What I began to think, honestly, was that he believed that what he was writing was true. Yeah. That I could have an entire conversation with him. We could record it. People could listen to it. He was hearing what he wanted to hear. And that happened over and over again. Needless to say, writing a very long thing about an article when you are Ray Dalio only gets more attention on the article. And again, he used a similar tactic with the book. And he has given you some attention, which I think you helped leverage. It was fantastic. We can skip ahead to this because I love. Yeah. No, I really do love talking about this. This book came out in November. There are two major business books that came out this fall before it. A book by Walter Isaacson, who's very well known, on Elon Musk, and then Michael Lewis, surprise, dropped a book on Sam Bankman-Fried. So I was sitting there and I was saying, I am neither of these men. And my subject is also not Elon Musk or SBF. The worst thing in the world would have been for me for the book to publish, and then just people were like a little exhausted of wealthy men behaving badly. But Ray just kept attacking me. The book would have done well. I had a lot of plans for how to make sure the book did well and that people knew what I'd gone through. But, he had spent years telling people close to himself, we're just going to ignore it, we're going to ignore it, we're going to ignore it. And then I heard 2 weeks before it came out that they had gotten a copy of the book, or a copy of part of the book. I don't know how, but these things happen. Yeah. Harry Potter leaks a week. This is just like Harry Potter. But these things happen. And then I just heard from people inside Bridgewater, you have no idea what they're going to do. And it's fantastic. They sent out letters. Yeah. They complained. He went to Abu Dhabi and complained about me at a conference. They hired PR firms to call. I mean, it was like you couldn't have made me a bigger deal. Yeah. Yeah, fed right into the strategy. And you can you admit that you leaked some of those letters that the lawyers sent? Absolutely. I mean, they had spent many years threatening me through these very famous libel attorneys. And every time I got a letter, I just saved them. And then I went to New York Post, I went to other places, and I just said, this is the book you're not supposed to read. Right. They're trying to stop. I think that was the tagline, the book Ray doesn't want you to read. Yeah, I don't think I wrote her headline, but I certainly, But also, if you just know anything about sort of the dynamics between journalists, a journalist also has some sympathy for a journalist who's being threatened. Yeah. So I think he really has so limited experience outside of his own firm, with the people who worked for him, with the people who tell him that he's right all the time. Yeah. So let's get into that, because like you said, you reconstructed, and it's amazing because you went back, because when you started reporting on Bridgewater and Ray, the firm was 35 years old, or correct? Yeah. Yeah, it was fairly established at that time. You go back to his childhood,
right? And so I just want to talk a little bit about that because you get into his upbringing and you detail how he kind of he was kind of bounced around a little bit, sought out wealth. He glommed onto a wealthy family and married into an either wealthier one.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about his upbringing and kind of how he, how he navigated his early career.
So Ray, like so many other big-time business figures now, love to talk about how they came up with it all on their own. And there are some people like this. But the story that he has stuck to is that he is a son of a jazz musician. His mother died when he was a teenager. He had a mail route, and that he rose through from really nowhere to found the world's biggest hedge fund. And those facts are all true. That's all true. But he left out these two major legs up. One, as you mentioned, his wife is a Vanderbilt Whitney, and he marries her very young. He never mentions this publicly. And so when he talks about how he started Bridgewater out of his 2-bedroom apartment, what he doesn't talk about is that he started Bridgewater out of a 4-floor townhome, actually. Maybe he technically filed the papers for the thing called Bridgewater out of a 2-bedroom apartment. But by the time he was running it, he was already married to this very wealthy family. You can only imagine. The thing that really shocked me, though, I'd known that. But what really shocked me was that I never had been able to figure out how did he go from this sort of like no-name Long Island community college almost to Harvard Business School to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. He's always said he wasn't a great student, so I couldn't say he was like a prodigy. And I finally got in touch with someone who said, I've been waiting for someone to call me for decades.
Wow.
Because my family, the Lives, are with this famous New York brokerage family that took him in. He was their golf caddy and really made him their surrogate son and raised him on Park Avenue and sent him on vacations to Europe with their troubled son and got him his job on the New York Stock Exchange. None of this is illegal.
Right.
And I even would say good on Ray of all these caddies, impressing a family and getting the advantage. But he never, ever gave them credit. Not in all of his books, in his interviews, and anything, never mentioned them. Yeah. And I won't spoil the book, but there's a moment in the book where he has a chance to repay the favor, and you can find out what happens then. Yeah. But I was just blown away that he was so committed to this rags to riches story that he couldn't even admit. Yeah. This huge part of his upbringing. It would be, I couldn't fathom it. Yeah,
and it is. I didn't know that full circle was coming around at the end. That was a really interesting little end note there, a little surprise. But yeah, you'll have to read the book. Yeah. But you started the book kind of interesting. I want to ask if this was your decision or an editorial decision. You started the book with, and we're going to talk about the principles a little bit more and how they got established. And they would have these trials at Bridgewater. And you start the book with a chapter about a trial of Katina Stefanova. Is that right? And I was going to have you read from it, but you said you can just pretty much describe it. So tell me why you started there and describe that scene and what happened.
So I had heard for years inside Bridgewater that they have these things they call diagnoses. Again, there's a whole language inside Bridgewater that's just for Bridgewater. And the idea is that there can be no such thing as a problem that's too small. Everything should be investigated, and we should find the reason for it. And I had heard in particular that there was this one really disturbing tape of a woman being upset, and that Ray was interrogating her over mistakes that she had made, and that this tape was played over and over again as an example for how you have to push through your pain for reflection, and then you can have progress. Though I'd heard about it for years, honestly, it never struck me as anything other than just another sort of extreme Bridgewater aphorism. I think we've all been through moments in our life where we've had pain, and then with reflection, we've had progress. So I sort of understood what he was saying. And then when I was talking to people about it and reconstructing it, it is a tape of him tearing into screaming at this woman. And she is sobbing at a table. And it turns out she's one of his surrogate daughters. She's one of the top people at the firm. And she storms out of the room at some point. And then he brings her back into the room. And he plays this tape for years
Yeah.
for job applicants and says, this is what we're like here. And I found out even later that the whole time she was pregnant. So it wasn't just that she was upset because, she was being interrogated by her boss, but she was literally pregnant the whole time. And he knew that she had the baby. It was no secret. And he continued to use this as an example, as an exemplar, really, of behavior at Bridgewater. Yeah. And so I wanted to put that it's not the very first scene of the book, but it's very close, because this is a real life person. This is her actual name. There's only one pseudonym in the whole book. Everyone else is a real name. Like, these are real people with real lives. And by the way, she doesn't quit after that. She stays for another 5 years. So if in reading the book or listening to it or however you want to consume it, if you can't get a sense of why people stay or why this might appeal to people, then I think I haven't done my job.
Yeah. Yeah, it's disturbing, and what's crazy is that it's not the most, well, it could be the most disturbing, but there are other scenes like this throughout the book. There are a lot of other these investigations that happen, and it's startling. So I do want to go back, because even though this is a multi-layered book, but Ray built a fortune by running a hedge fund. But you kind of present him as a mediocre talent. You talked about, how he started Bridgewater. I did not know he started as a commodities import-export business, thus the name Bridgewater. So that was interesting. But he and then pivoted to working for a boutique consultancy. But it was really a way of dealing with people. And this I thought was interesting, because he understood what wealthy people wanted, maybe because of the people that took him in. You understand that people with generational wealth weren't consumed with the hottest stock or strategy. They wanted to protect and accumulate wealth that way. They were focused more on protecting and staying rich. So how did he leverage that and use that throughout his career?
This was a big difference for me from a lot of the other books I've read about Wall Street, or the articles, frankly, I've read and written. There's a whole genre of book which is essentially, we're going to invest a little bit of money into this company and it's going to make $1 trillion, or I'm the man who solved the market. A very good book,
right.
But about trying to make the most you can. And what Ray knew, both from his experience with this very wealthy family and with his wife, was that actually once you're already rich, not just rich, but once you're already, really intergenerationally wealthy, you are obsessed with not losing it, with not being the one that blew it. Yeah. So he sort of learned how to appeal to these people. And way before quantitative trading was popular on Wall Street, obviously way before, you had an E-Trade account or anything like that, he was able to say, I have an investment system.
Yeah.
And the system rules all. So you don't have to worry. I'm not trying to shoot the lights out every day. Like, I'm trying to protect your money. And not only that, but he was very good at constantly identifying that there was like a doomsday around the corner, and that you should really be careful and you should give him your money because he's the one who's trying to, stop you from calamity. There are other investment managers who try to do this. There's no one on earth who's been more successful at it than Ray Dalio.
Yeah, I like you detail from like the 80s, he was kind of this doom and gloom, and he was often wrong, right? Because I think in a New York Times interview in 1982, he stated that the U.S. was headed for a historic economic collapse, and that just didn't happen. But it was because he kind of used this vehicle of fear to generate kind of people, saying that they just wanted to protect their money. But you called it his Chicken Little tour.
I did, yeah. And not just 1982, but in going on, there's something funny that happens after 1982. Well, it's not funny, but it is. He claims after 1982 that this prediction was so wrong that he had to lay everyone off, and that he had to borrow $4,000 from his dad to sell his car just to stay afloat. He was married to a Vanderbilt Whitney.
Yeah.
He has never gone off this. I've never been able to get him to just admit, like, hey, that was a little bit of an exaggeration, right? You also were living in this palatial place. Like, what are you talking about? You had to sell the car. But he even uses that. He uses that to say, I was wrong. It's so long ago now that it's such an almost irrelevant lesson. But in so many interviews, he will say, I learned my lesson in 1982. I hit bottom.
Yeah. He uses this again and again, but he starts to, like you said, gain traction. And later on, we'll skip little ahead a little bit. It's not just wealthy families, but he sets his sights on huge corporations, and he pitches this hedging strategy. And that seemed to be a watershed moment because it wasn't just wealthy families giving him a few million here or there. Talk about how he resonated with these companies and how he used it to gather those assets.
It was honestly fascinating. I learned a lot about it. I mean, if you're, for instance, literally one of his clients was McDonald's. And if you're McDonald's, you obviously don't want to have to raise or lower the price of a McNuggets based on how much a chicken is going for this quarter. So he used financial instruments to sort of fix the price of the grain, fix the price of the farming, so that they knew every quarter what they would pay, so that they could have the same price for McNuggets, in every store. He also was incredibly smart about realizing that there are, for every 100, hyper wealthy, famous Rockefeller type family, there are another 100 of these big sovereign wealth funds and these government institutions, and even things like, I have no idea what the Troutbeck endowment is, but organizations like this, nonprofits, which have perennial wealth and need to invest it. And he would go to them with that same pitch, and he would say, do you want Troutbeck to turn into apartment complexes? Right. Of course not. Like, I will help protect your nut.
Yeah. And it's successful. And so he has what's called, what was the first one? The Pure Alpha Fund? Was that the first kind of strategy?
He had an earlier one, but that was his first major,
right. Yeah. And then this all-weather fund. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit of good timing. And so by the early aughts, the firm grows to over $100 billion. And this is by 2004. So you could say they're a successful firm, obviously. The firm is growing, doing well. And then you position it as that he's having mastered, in his view at least, how to build how to build a set of investment rules. He sets out to do the same for management. But what's the catalyst for that? Because this a little bit, I know this is on the heels of a senior hire that went bad, Britt Harris. Mm. He had led Verizon's investment management, and then only lasted 6 months. So how did that kind of lead to him thinking he could do what he did for investment?
So this honestly is the crux of the book, and it's why I loved talking about it. It's why I loved writing the book. It's why I think the book is a lot of fun. Watch me continue to sell this book to a room of mostly people who've read it, who are listening to it. Which is that in around 2005, Ray Dalio is already a billionaire, and Bridgewater is one of the second or third biggest hedge funds in the world. So he's achieved he's done it. But he starts to search for like a higher meaning. He needs something to be about something more than just money. So he starts to come up with these principles. But I can't emphasize this enough. The principles, which are the thing that becomes so famous, that becomes a big part of my book, that becomes, you're all going to get ads, by the way, for principles on your way out here. Like they'll know.
Follow you.
It will follow you. He spends so much. But he doesn't come up with the principles until after. It is a retrofit for his success. It has nothing to do with what made him successful. And I think that's part of why it goes so awry and so wacky, is that he's like fumbling trying to make the jigsaw puzzle fit. So he comes up with these principles, these rules for management. And at first they're, it's just a few on a piece of paper, and they're logical. They're, we should be more honest with one another. We should have a process for hashing out disputes. We should find the most reliable people, and we should listen to them more than less reliable people. I know it sounds obvious, but when your billionaire CEO boss sends out a poorly spelled Microsoft Word document that says these things, I know a lot of people who would say, yes, sir. Yeah, absolutely. We should do better, not worse. Then, these principles, they metastasize and they're weaponized, and that becomes really the crux of my narrative and of, I believe, the legacy of Bridgewater.
The legacy are the principles that he's...
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the book is called Principles.
Well, his book.
His book. Sorry. Oh, wow. Thank you. Yeah. The second best book.
The other.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, actually, can I tell you this? The book, the book, The Fund, I actually pitched it originally. The book was pitched as, it was called Unprincipled. And I have we could have published it, by the way. But I actually thought he actually isn't unprincipled.
Yeah.
After I had spent so many years then interviewing people, he does have an animating set of principles. And does he act in an unprincipled way a lot? Yes. But it was like almost unfair, I thought.
Okay.
So
That's
There's a scoop. That's a scoop right here. For
we just broke some news. Okay.
Yeah.
But and even the principles came out of this hire that didn't work out. But also it was started innocently enough with an issue log, right? Where it was basically something like, why is he paying so much attention? And it morphs into this issue log where people can complain about everything, but it was because Ray was paying attention to it that other employees would log things about things happening as minor as a coffee pot being left empty. Like, why was he so focused on an issue log, and what was the relation there to the development of principles?
So this is a principle in the end, which is at Bridgewater there is no such that at Bridgewater we have to probe badness. Everything can be badness. So if you walk past the coffee pot and it is empty, it is badness that you did not do something to fix it. If you were supposed to execute a trade and you didn't, that is badness.
Yeah.
The problem with and so they create this thing called the issue log, which lists them all, and then I can see what you put in, and I can opine on whether actually you were too late to put in the issue. I can rate you on it, et cetera. But what becomes so wild is, look, it is a hedge fund.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of people working for them. But the great fun is that there actually aren't that many issues, in all of our lives. I hope maybe some of us have more. But and so people just start putting in the issue log just the most mundane things. The peas are wilted. There's a urinal story. There's a whiteboard story, and if it weren't true, you'd think I was making it all up. But this is what happens when you tell people there's no such thing that we must find all badness. That all of a sudden people will essentially create badness.
Yeah. So as you know, he becomes so focused on these principles, and this is the focus of him for really the next decade. And so the principles do become systematized. Employees become rated, and they even have essentially their own baseball cards. And fellow employees rate each other on their interactions. And this is a major part of the book, as you said. The culture is centered around the idea of truth and honesty. But Ray finds an issue with the systemization of it. Tell me what happened with the rating system.
This was a big reveal to me. Because Ray has spent a lot of time, he's done TED Talks about this, he's been on 60 Minutes, he's been on every program talking about how at Bridgewater everyone is rated on a quantitative scale, so that if you and I were sitting next to each other, I could just pull up your statistics and I could say, oh, you're much better at listening than me, or I'm much better at probing to find the truth, obviously. Sure. And we could, instead of arguing about it, instead of having and everyone else, by the way, everyone would be rating us right now.
Yeah, you should all have iPads. You could rate us. Go ahead.
It would be, and if you weren't, by the way, we would be rating you down for not
rating us.
For not rating us. It really is it's wonderful. But the problem is that people start rating Ray negatively, which, as someone in the book points out, is a sign that the system is working. Right. Is that we should be trying to find the talent in our ranks, the talent that can only be found when we're all being honest with one another. And I'd known for years, if not a decade, about this system and how it worked. I didn't know that Ray ordered it to be literally rigged. I'm not spoiling the book. This is actually the intro. But that Ray finds out that there are people who are rated higher than him in important categories, and he makes them redo it so that he is hardwired to be the top. So that doesn't only mean that he looks the best, by the way. It also means that when he's rating you, his rating counts the most. It's not one vote, one man. It's a weighted vote. And so you can imagine how, literally 10 years later, when Ray is standing on a TED Talk, millions of people watching it on YouTube, saying this is a wonderful system, it works.
Right.
Of course Ray thinks it works. His opinion always wins out. I would also think the system works. Right. I'd be like, this is great. Everything I say is working out. Yeah. But getting that and finding that out was very difficult. Yeah. I think it can be very sad to a lot of people who work there or had friends and family who worked there, because you can be pushed down so hard by the ratings. If Ray or someone who Ray has elevated thinks that you're bad at something, you get in a hole and you really can't.
Yeah. He hired a lot of high-profile people over the years, top execs from companies like IBM, Apple, Microsoft. Majority of them left, some rather quickly, some broken from the experience. They'd often find the job much different from when they thought it was. And one of those people was James Comey, who probably is familiar to a lot of people for different reasons. Some people may not know he worked at Bridgewater. So talk about the hiring of Comey, his role at Bridgewater, and why he left.
First of all, God bless. I'm Jewish, so I'm not going to cross myself. But God bless Jim Comey, because Jim Comey was hired at Bridgewater in 2011. He stayed for 3 years as general counsel, and they called him the godfather of the firm. And a problem when you're writing a book or just telling a story generally about something on Wall Street is that there can be a limited number of people who know these characters. And so Jim Comey does some wild things at Bridgewater, which I'll talk about.
Yeah.
But that's all before you've all heard of Jim Comey. That all happens before Hillary, whatever, et cetera, however you feel about anything.
Yeah.
So Ray hires him. He had been the DA of the Southern District of New York. He was a famous person, but he wasn't world famous. And Ray puts him in charge of investigating the badness inside Bridgewater and gives him carte blanche to do anything. And now we know that Jim Comey loves the attention, and that this must have been Jim's dream, is to be given a videotaping crew and the ability to walk into any meeting. But he goes there for 3 years and he just tears up the firm.
Yeah.
And a challenge of this book, honestly, is it's a fun book, and I wanted it to be fun, and so it's not supposed to be a bummer, and it's not a bummer. I will say I didn't leave a single Jim Comey anecdote out of this book. I was like, anything that involves Jim stays in the book. And we can talk more if you want, but I later found out Jim has now written his own book. It's a fiction book. It's called Westport. It's a murder mystery that takes place at the world's biggest hedge fund called Saugatuck Associates. I have begged the New York Times Book Review to let me review it.
Yeah.
I don't know if they'll let me. I was like, you don't have to pay me. But
I did not know. Wow.
Yeah. He could, and I emailed Jim. I said, if a journalist shows up dead on chapter 2 of this goddamn book,
So was he gone by the time you started reporting on Bridgewater?
He was gone, and he left in very sketchy circumstances. No one really knew why he was involved in the investigation of sexual harassment matters. But by the time I started reporting on it, he was starting to get more famous in a way.
Right. So, okay, I want to speed up a little bit because a couple of more things I want to talk about, because I think what's critical is Ray really you talked about the media, the TED Talk. Ray really built his public persona to where he broke out of kind of being financially famous and was just famous. How did he use the media I know he also published, obviously, The Principles in what it was 2017. And then he went on this book tour. He started to be at Bridgewater less and less. To talk about the kind of use of the media and how it's so critical to him.
It's unbelievable, honestly, because there are a lot of successful people and unsuccessful people in finance who get a lot of critical press, justified or not. And I've been blown away by how little critical press there is of him outside of me and my colleagues who I've written articles with. And it's because he will spend so much time with you. Mm-hmm. And it is intoxicating to have someone that important, that wealthy, to sit there, to spend hours with you, to explain his philosophy. Then you can write an article which says Ray Dalio, the founder of the world's biggest hedge fund, thinks China is up and coming, or much more likely thinks the economy is going to hell. Right. He also uses academics. He pays academics to come into Bridgewater and write studies about him. And Adam Grant, a very famous author, very successful, devotes a chapter of his book to Ray, calls him an originalist, says that he has created like a model for corporate behavior. But what Adam never says is that Adam then went on the Bridgewater payroll and was paid, I don't know how much, but to this day, to be a consultant for Ray. For me, it's a lesson that with enough money, you really do get to create your own version of reality there. And he's better at that than any. Listen, there are some likable and unlikable men and women all across Wall Street, Silicon Valley, et cetera. But I don't know of anyone who spent as much time trying to like empirically convince the world that they were great.
Yeah. So we'll let you buy the book and read it because there are a lot of great stories in terms of the trials. Some of them are really tough to read, like literally grown men crying, pregnant women we know crying, top execs cracking. I mean, it's a fun read, but it's a little dark at times. There were employees that dealt with mental health issues because of the firm, contemplated suicide. So we know a lot of these videos were videotaped and used for training. These were all videotaped. I asked you before, did you ever see any of the videos?
Well, first of all, they kept all the videos in something they called the Transparency Library. So you can't make this stuff up. They've released some highly edited videos, which I watched because I should watch everything. I did not see the videos. However, because everything at Bridgewater was taped and so many people saw it, I could have firsthand sources who could describe to me what it was like and could tell me what happened even if they weren't in the room. I had people who had taken real-time notes on things, and they gave it to me, and they had literally written down everything that had happened. It's a mind challenge, I will say. I won't use profanity, which is that you can talk to two people in the same room for the same situation, and they will describe it differently, and neither of them is lying.
Yeah.
So like your memory colors what happens. So what I just really tried to do was write the best possible version of it. The nice thing is, when it's all recorded, a third party, a person who wasn't involved, the person who wasn't being probed or isn't crying, they often do have a very, matter-of-fact memory of it. And Ray and Bridgewater were proud of these videos. Yeah. They were proud of this. Yeah. They said, you need to go through this to attain a higher level version of yourself.
It's unbelievable because I'm watching this. My wife and I like to watch documentaries about cults. And you're always sitting there like, how? A lot of times there were very smart people you're watching. You're like, how do these people fall under the spell? I could understand a lot of these people were really well paid, but was Bridgewater a cult?
Well, I would say my lawyers have an answer for this question.
You were very careful. You were very careful in this book, obviously. But yeah, what's your take?
Well, my lawyers would like me to say that Bridgewater is a closed society which operates with a charismatic leader according to a strict dogma, with harsh punishments to those who attempt to leave. There are people in the book who tell Ray it is a cult. They use that word.
Yeah.
They put it in writing. And there's something I left out of the book, actually, which is that at one point, it will surprise no one here, there are tests to do with the principals. You have to take the principals' tests, and you're graded, and you can be fired, et cetera. Someone tries to leak the principal's test to Charlie Rose. He faxes it to Charlie Rose. And this happens about halfway through the book. And I didn't put this in the book, but on the cover sheet of the fax, he says, Charlie, you can't spell culture without C-U-L-T.
That's great.
So it's something that has come up, obviously, a lot.
Yeah.
I will say people who are in cults generally do not agree with you when you tell them you are in a cult. And there's a big difference between Bridgewater and Scientology and the NXIVM organization, which was not too far from here, which is that Bridgewater pays you a lot of money. So imagine that they're promising you a higher level version of yourself. You have to go through pain and have progress. But also, we're going to pay you a ton for it. I'll give you one other answer to that, which is that if you haven't watched this series, The Vow, which is about NXIVM, it's really fascinating. And there's an episode of it in which a woman is locked in a room and she doesn't leave for 2 years. She's a young woman. She's maybe 20. And her family is in the organization too. And I'll spoil the end of the episode for you, which is that the door was never locked. She could have left. She was not physically barred in that room, but she did not want to leave that room. I think when you're not in these organizations, you can think, well, why wouldn't you don't you just see it, or I can't believe you would, but there is an emotional, psychological component to this that she, for 2 years, did not open the door.
The unraveling, because that's part of it. The unraveling of a Wall Street legend doesn't happen really until 2020. A couple of things happen. Dalio's 42-year-old son dies. They obviously were going through the pandemic, but later in 2020, there's a discrimination suit by employee Eileen Murray, for $100 million. Was that the first public suit about Bridgewater?
It wasn't the first public one. It was the highest profile because
Yeah.
she had been CEO. But this is such a great example too. Right before Eileen Murray, their former CEO, sues, like 2 weeks before, she's at a conference on stage in front of 1,000 people, and she says, Bridgewater is like a family. So people
Yeah.
like Eileen, they participate in this culture right up until the moment in which it's advantageous for them to sue.
Yeah.
But she sues, that breaks it open. The unraveling to me is also, it's the unraveling of the idea that these principles did anything, that were worth anything, that this high-minded philosophy amounted to anything in the end. I have gotten criticized for the term unraveling because the firm is still around.
Right.
I wasn't implying that the firm would like collapse based on one book, but I do think the unraveling of his legend, the unraveling of the fictional character of Ray Dalio is a real thing.
I'll have to say there's a bit of Schadenfreude in the book, and I feel like you enjoy it a little bit.
I enjoyed writing it, or I enjoyed
The Schadenfreude.
I think it's a great story, to be honest. My lawyers would like me to say. No, I mean, it is stranger than fiction. It is I did enjoy writing it. I enjoyed showing you these characters who you think will be heroes, and then you see them succumb to the very thing that they said at the beginning they would never do.
Yeah.
There is a little bit of a Schadenfreude in it, in the sense that I speak to so many, as part of just my day job, hyper successful people. Ray is not the only one who claims to be like about more than money or about more than that. And I just think he's such a great paradigm of this example of like whatever happened to just saying like, oh yeah, I just want to make the most money.
Right.
That's it. That's like, this is America. You're allowed. This is capitalism. This is your choice. So in a way, it's not even a criticism of Ray. It's just like this general ethos now of we're here to save the world. It's a great, hilarious thing. Or at one point, Ray points to his watch in an interview. He says, it's a $150 Orvis watch. I don't even care about my watches. That month he buys the most expensive house in Connecticut. It's just like,
So it gets back to this whole dichotomy. But I'll just end with this, because you report extensively. You're not a character in the book, but you are, because you talk about Wall Street Journal reporter wrote a story, and that's obviously you. How much impact was it? The lawsuit? Was it the death of his son? We know a lawyer finally tells him, "You got to get rid of these tapes, man. This is a bigger lawsuit waiting to happen." How much impact do you think the reporting had versus Tell me a little bit, one, about the Bridgewater today as it exists, and how much impact do you think the reporting, or just these facts and more people coming out talking about Bridgewater, impacted the fund?
It's hard to say how much like my reporting would have done, because I think that this was a house of cards that would inevitably have fallen on. How many metaphors can I combine in one sentence? So I do think that there was a lot of external pressure, including some from my reporting. Ray did eventually allegedly retire. He stayed away for about 2 weeks and then immediately tried to unretire. The performance has been just terrible since 2010. So, ultimately, an investment management firm does have to make money for its clients by some metric.
Yes.
And I actually would give Ray a huge amount of credit, is that there is no firm on earth that could produce the sort of insipid performance that Bridgewater has and still be so large. So, but I don't think the story is over, to be honest.
Is there another book in you?
There is. I don't know what it is, but it won't be called The Fund 2. But
you were
still enjoying this one.
You were very careful, and again, he built his wealth with the hedge fund, but you're very careful because there were a lot of questions about the hedge fund. People investigate it. You're very careful not to call it a fraud. Some had maybe thought it was a Ponzi scheme. The SEC had looked into it, so it's not. It seems to be just a very basic kind of macro trend following strategy.
There's an element of fraud to Ray Dalio and Bridgewater Associates, but it is a cultural fraud, in my opinion.
I think that's a good place to end it. That's your time on Read the Bull. Thank you very much, Rob.
Thank you.